I know we just prayed, but is it okay if I pray again? No problem with that. I'm just going to kneel. Dear Heavenly Father, we just want to thank you that we're here right now. The fact that we even have breath in our lungs is grace from you, and we just want to praise you for that. And Father, as Tim and I are going to speak today, we just pray that you empty us of self. May people not see us, but may they really see you, because the reality is we just want to glorify you and I guess give a better glimpse into what your heart is for all of us here and for those that aren't here as well. We just ask that the Holy Spirit just teach us and just open our minds and our hearts to what it is that you want us to know today and to live out. We pray in your precious name. Amen. Looking at me here, what do you see? Probably the first 3 words that you wouldn't think of are adultery, abuse, and adoption. I'll give you a bit of a background into that. So my background is in Mount Isa, which I've told you. I have a mum and a dad and a brother. And when I was about 9 years old, I noticed a church elder taking a keen interest in my mum, because apart from my brother and I, she attended church alone. It was small, but I noticed it, and it was a bit sinister. Something about it just wasn't right. And eventually it turned into a huge mess. I firsthand witnessed the damage done to my family, as well as the elders' family, the church family, and the wider community. It just damaged a lot of people. Adultery, though, it isn't always like physical at first. It all starts in here, and it will eventually manifest itself. I personally couldn't understand how a church elder, like someone who's given a position of trust, who was a leader of like these people who are wanting to follow God, could do something like that. I couldn't understand how my mum went along with it for so long either. But when it comes down to it, I realised it's all deception, really. People are deceived, and that's never God's intention. When it comes to abuse, I was 20. I was in a relationship. He was a Christian, so that's pretty good. We both went to the same church. That's good as well. Everyone else seemed really approving of it. But abuse isn't always physical either, as I soon found out. After seeing my own parents' marriage fall apart, it made me, like, some people think, oh, there is no good marriages out there. It's all doom and gloom. But it just made me even more determined that I wouldn't be like that. Like, I'm not going to be a person that it just falls apart with. And, yeah, it was the wrong context. It wasn't marriage. I allowed my boundaries to be crossed. My self-respect completely diminished. And I had allowed myself to become isolated from my family and friends. I guess it's fear-related, because I was afraid, so I stayed instead of saying no. And, that's not what God intended either, but I was deceived too. It wasn't too long after these experiences that a whole lot of other things sort of happened, and lots of different losses. So my parents' marriage eventually, after years of being a bit of a yo-yo thing, finally fell apart. Like, Dad disappeared one day, came back a week later saying it's over for good. My mum then was obviously wrapped up in her grief and her despair over it all. My brother cut me off and shut me out. My cat died. That's pretty serious, guys. Like, if you love your pets, that's just traumatic. And I had just started my nursing career, so that was I was consciously incompetent, and I was in the palliative care area, and I experienced my first patient death. And not long after that, my then boyfriend called it quits, and I literally had nothing left to hold on to, because we hold on to these things, somehow we get our identity from them, or we lean on them, and that all came apart. But in these experiences, I learnt something that was very valuable, I guess. If God is going to get through to us, he'll often use our brokenness. He doesn't have to, but for me, he did. we need to, I guess, get the scales taken off our eyes, if you don't mind that analogy, because deception is we think that everything else will give us our value, that's where everything is based in, but reality is it's God, but for some reason we're just deceived into thinking it's all these other things. So as you may know, I'm a Bible worker here at Kingscliff now, and studying the Bible with people has been awesome. And I was studying the Bible with this one lovely lady, and we looked at Luke 15, and there were just some awesome vital truths brought to light on this that made sense of the past pains and just made sense of God's reconciliation towards us. So if we could all turn there together. Just someone say amen when you're there. Okay, we all there? Yeah? Cool. So I'll start reading along with you. So then all the tax collectors and the sinners drew near to him to hear him. This is Jesus. And the Pharisees and scribes complained, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them." So he spoke this parable to them, saying, "What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he loses one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one which is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and neighbors, saying to them, 'Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost.' I say to you that likewise there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 just persons who need no repentance." This is something that I'd, heard of before in primary, Sabbath schools and things. It's cool, he gets a sheep. But when you look at the words here, he says what man of you having 100 sheep? Who doesn't do this? Who doesn't go after that one sheep? Even though it seems to not make sense. This sheep, so it gets itself lost. Sheep aren't the smartest animals. We don't know what the sheep's condition was found in. If you notice, it doesn't say at all whether the sheep had fallen down some cliffs or something, or gotten all bloodied up or attacked by animals. It's probably not in a good state, and it probably stinks. But either way, it says here that when the shepherd finds it, he lays it on his shoulders rejoicing. So, in the condition he finds us in, the condition he found me in, he was rejoicing over me, even though I probably wasn't anything to rejoice over. And yet he lays us on his shoulders. And in the journey home, he's rejoicing along that journey home. And it doesn't specify whether that journey is an easy one. I doubt it was. There's probably hills and valleys and rivers to cross and things. But he carries that sheep on his shoulders and he rejoices in that whole journey home. I don't know, just let that sit with you, because yes, the journey is headed home, but we don't know how long that's going to take. We don't know how rough it's going to be, but he still finds joy in each part of that journey, because the ultimate goal is to get home. We'll read on again. So we'll go from verse 8. So the next story is the lost coin. "Or what woman having 10 silver coins, if she loses one coin, does not light a lamp, sweep the house, and search carefully until she finds it? And when she has found it, she calls her friends and neighbors together, saying, 'Rejoice with me, for I have found the piece which I lost.' Likewise, I say to you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents." Just one. So this coin is lost, right? A little bit different to a sheep. Coins don't have brains. Coins don't know that they are lost. They also don't know that they are valuable. And the coin didn't get lost somewhere in the wilderness, did it? It was lost in the house. So, I don't know. Let's keep that in mind. Being lost in the house, I wonder what that's like. What is the house? And the person searching for it. So the woman, I guess we can see that as representing God. She still goes in search for it, even though it's in her house. But she doesn't just search for it, like, oh, how to look there. Like, sorry, she didn't have a man look. She had a careful look. She searched everywhere. And isn't that how God is with us? Like, he doesn't just have a man look. He actually thoroughly goes searching everywhere for us. And he doesn't give up on it. And when he has found us, he rejoices. And maybe we don't fully get the rejoicing in it too, because maybe we're a bit like a coin that doesn't get it. So we'll carry on. There's another story. So this is continuing on in Luke 15, the final lost thing. So verse 11, we'll read there. Verse 11 and 12. Then he said, a certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falls to me. So he divided to them his livelihood. Now that doesn't sound like anything interesting. You just read over that. He gave them stuff. But in society back then, it was a general no-no to ask your dad for your inheritance before he was dead. His son's pretty much saying, hey dad, wish you were dead. I want my stuff now. But it says here the dad, the father, he divides the portion, not just to the younger son, but to the older one, to both of them. I don't know, any dads here, would you appreciate your kid going, hey, can you give me what's in the will? I just wish you were dead. Wouldn't you want to just slap them over the head or something? But this father doesn't do that. He gives it to both of them. He divides it. He doesn't respond the way that maybe we would respond. So we'll carry on in verse 13. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, journeyed to a far country, and there wasted his possessions with prodigal living. But when he had spent all, there arose a severe famine in the land, and he began to be in want. Then he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into the fields to feed swine. And he would gladly have filled his stomach with the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. So he's kind of in a bad way, isn't he? Speaking of the context, he's speaking to Jewish people, right? Do Jewish people like pigs? Probably not. So he's in the lowest of the low positions, right? He is he squandered everything. He's at the bottom. He's feeding pigs. And his father was a rich, noble Jew, possibly, because he was able to divide all this stuff with him. And he finds himself right at the bottom. And it says here, but when he came to himself, he's coming to his senses now that he's at the bottom. He said, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough to spare, and I perish with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. We see, so he's coming to his senses now, and he realizes what his condition is. His deception is revealed. He knows that he probably should pay for what he's done. He's actually been a really awful son to his father. So he's got here this speech that he's got rehearsed. So I guess in this situation, you can see he's not worthy to be called a son, and he knows it. And he sees that, I guess I've got to make it right, so I'll be a servant. So in verse 20, he carries on with it. He arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. And he doesn't get to finish it. The father cuts in there. But the father said to his servants, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring the fatted calf here and kill it. Let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to be merry. So the father, he actually notices him. So how is he in a position to see his son a long way off? Do you think he was looking out for him? Do you think he was hoping his son would come home? So I don't know, that's pretty awesome that the father was actually looking out for him, even though his son had pretty much spat in his face, I wish you were dead, I'm taking all this stuff. And yet the father still had hoped that maybe Maybe my son would come back. And another thing, actually, I read this up recently, that in those days, middle-aged men, we imagine he was middle-aged or maybe older, depending on the age of his sons, but it was not a cultural acceptable thing for a man to run. And like they probably wore those robe skirt things, and so to lift that up was also very shameful. So he runs and he like is exposing his legs, and that's incredibly humiliating for like a Jewish man back then. But it doesn't matter to him that he's humiliating himself. None of that counts. All he cares about is his son who's come home. And I don't know, that's how God is towards you guys. Just in case like you've forgotten that. Like he doesn't care if it humiliates himself. You matter more to him than humiliation. So the son didn't get to say his planned speech, as we noticed, like make me as one of your hired servants. The father interrupted him, giving him 3 things. 3 is a really good number. People know that I like biblical numbers. So the first thing is a robe. So in exchange for his probably filthy, smelly, pig-covered rags, he gets a robe, and it's the best robe. He also gets a ring. And rings back then, they signified like an authority or like who you belong to, and it gave you like some kind of ownership in a way. And the father gives him a ring again. And his feet, he probably didn't have shoes. Servants didn't have shoes back then. But he gets given sandals. And it's as though the father has interrupted him before he can say, make me as your hired servant. Because he's like, you're a son, you're a son, you're a son. Just in case you didn't notice. There was nothing the son could do to earn his sonship again, even though he thought maybe being a servant would allow him to be accepted again. But it's nothing that the son can do. It's entirely up to the father to give that sonship to him. It's all the son could do is actually accept or reject it. There is nothing like we can do to earn or contribute to God's gift to us. Absolutely nothing. All you can do is accept or reject it. And now, so there was another son. Did we forget about him? Maybe. But we'll just keep reading. So verse 25 onwards, it says, now his older son, who's also part of the story, was in the field. And as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called to one of the servants and asked what these things meant. And he said to him, your brother has come, and because he has received him safely and sound, your father has killed the fatted calf. So the older son, he's like, wait, what? What's going on? Like, he didn't get invited to this party. What's this party that's happening? And his reaction, I don't know, would we react like that? But he was angry and would not go in. Did you remember that the father divided everything, so all his livelihood between the both of them? So technically, everything that the father owns belongs to both sons now. And the younger son spent everything, didn't he? So there's nothing left. All that's left belongs to the older son. So they've killed his fat cow, and they've taken everything that's his, and they're using it to celebrate for his younger brother, his wayward brother. I don't know that I would be very happy, probably because I'd feel justified in myself that, yeah, that's my stuff. Why are you using my stuff? We'll carry on there. So he was angry, right? But his father comes out to him and pleads with him. So he answers and says to his father, lo, these many years I've been serving you. I've never transgressed your commandment at any time, and yet you never gave me a young goat that I might make merry with my friends. But as soon as this son of yours comes home, he's devoured your livelihood with harlotry and prodigal living, and you killed the fatted calf for him. So the son doesn't want to come inside and celebrate. Again, the father goes out. So another son is outside of the house. Did you get that? Like, I guess there wasn't just one lost son. Maybe there was really 2 the whole time. There's not just the one prodigal son. There's a son who's lost in the house. Sound familiar? So the older son seems justified. He doesn't find joy in celebrating his wayward brother's return. Have you ever tried to disown someone and were like, I don't know, like, that's your side of the family, like, to your wife or something. Not that I'm married, like, I don't know that stuff. But, you know, when you disown someone, like, that's your person. They're not related to me. He calls him your son, not my brother. The oldest son, like, his language there just really amplifies the fact that the whole time he's been thinking of himself as a servant to his father rather than an actual son. Like, he says, like, your son, I've never transgressed stuff. I've been serving you. Like, you never give me anything. But everything was his. He was in the house with the father. Why wasn't he thinking straight? So we'll carry what the father says to him. I guess let's let that sit with us. So the father in verse 31 says to him, son, you are always with me, and all I have is yours. It was right that we should make merry and be glad. For your brother was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So I guess the older son had a bit of warped thinking. So the father had to remind him, son, you are always with me. You've been in the house with me the whole time. Everything I have is actually yours. We've been together all this time. And your brother who was lost, he's back home now. Let's celebrate. Like, that's something to be like, I don't know, just find joy in that because he was lost and he's found now. And it doesn't tell us what his reaction was, does it? We don't know what the older son chose, whether he chose to come in the house and celebrate or whether he chose to stay outside. And Jesus is pretty smart, hey? Like the way he always talks in parables and stuff. And it's probably a thing for us as well. Just like, are you going to stay outside of the house or are you going to come in and celebrate? So in this story, it just amplifies the fact that God finds you and he finds joy in you. There's nothing you can do to change that. He's going to go and search for you regardless of whether you want him to, but you choose whether he picks you up and carries you home, whether he gets to rejoice in actually having you back. Like, that's your choice. And yeah, we all get that choice. Are you going to be someone who thinks of yourself as a servant rather than a son, even though, or daughter? Because the whole time, like, you are his child. That's how he sees you. You do not have to earn anything. You're not paving your way to, like, heaven or whatever. Like, there's nothing you can do. I just have to reiterate that. So, reconciliation, reconcile, that's my word today. So to reconcile, so the word is so it means again, and then conciliate, it's like to bring back on good terms, to have again. And we can see that as it's the restoration of friendly relations. You might be familiar with the words that we were once enemies of God, but now he's made us friends again. We're his children. It's the action of making one view or belief compatible with another. So again, it's like we were just at odds with God. Like, we were just in a completely different direction with him. We were heading another way. But yeah, he helps us take away that deception, and we see that we're heading the right direction when we're with him. Like, it's just, that's the way we should be headed. And it's actually the better way. It's the way that leads to life, not death. And it's the action of making financial accounts consistent. And didn't he say that the wages of sin is death, and he dies on a cross, and that debt is paid, it is finished? God did all those things. We didn't have any part of making any of those things happen. It was all him to reconcile us. That's his job. Our job is to respond. And so my favorite book in the Bible is Colossians. It's pretty awesome. And I was wondering if we could turn to Colossians chapter 1. And so the Bible is literally full of reconciliation to God. Like, that's the whole story. Like, what was, and then him trying to bring us back again. And Colossians 1, verse 19 to 23, I find just sums it up for me in a good way, and I hope it makes sense for you too. All good if I start reading? Yeah? So for it pleased the Father that in him, in Jesus, all fullness should dwell, and by him to reconcile all things to himself. By him, whether things on earth or things in heaven, making peace through the blood of his cross. And you who were once alienated and enemies in your mind by wicked works, yet now he is reconciled in the body of his flesh through death to present you holy and blameless and above reproach in his sight. If indeed you continue in the faith, grounded and steadfast, and are not moved away from the hope of the gospel which you heard, which was preached to every creature under heaven, of which I, Paul, became a minister. And once you've been reconciled, maybe it's part of our thing to help reconcile others. Maybe instead of like, I, Paul, have become a minister, you who have experienced reconciliation, put your name there. You become someone who shares that reconciliation as well. Oh, also, guys, I forgot to talk about adoption. Yeah, it'll make sense. So you might be wondering where adoption comes into it. So the shepherd went and searched for me a long time ago before I was even aware of it. He found me, but I didn't recognize him, not till I was about 16. And in him, I found a love that I'd never known before. In him, I found that there was literally nothing I could do, that I had to just cooperate with him and let him do the saving, let him do like the carrying of me on that journey. And you've heard by the bits of the other parts of my story that it has not been a smooth journey. There have been many ups and downs. And I guess God knows all of us very well. And to be fully known and fully loved, that's pretty amazing. He knows all my flaws. He knows all my just rubbish. And yet he loves me completely. And he does that for all of us. Like, don't forget that. I know that I need him. And like, honestly, where else would I go? I just don't see life making sense without him. Like, how does it? It just doesn't compute. Like, I'm not a computer, but you know. So as I go on this journey with him, there's still stuff that's in me that's awful, and it comes up, and I'm like, it's okay, because he's taking me on a trajectory home, and he's the one that's like making it better. He's making me new. He's replacing things. He's given me a robe instead of my rags. He's giving me a ring for like what I've got. I've got nothing. Like, he gives it to us. And so the journey has also, as you heard, I came from a place called Mount Isa in the bush. He took me into like pediatric nursing at one of the leading hospitals in Australia, called me to Arise, and then now I'm Bible working here at Kingscliff. And like, my inclination is to be comfortable and to like self-preservation. Like, I shouldn't be up here right now because I'm like, oh, but like God calls you to do things that aren't comfortable, but that's part of the journey. Like, it's him carrying you through it all. And yeah, like the journey, he finds joy in me through all the ups and downs. He finds joy in all of us. Like, don't be so down that sometimes there are lows, but the ultimate direction is home. And he's finding joy in you in every part of that journey, because it's him that's carrying you, not anyone else, not you, it's him. And I just wanted to finish off with this one quote that it just makes sense of a lot of things. I say a lot of things make sense. I'm praying that they're making sense for you. To make us, all of us, children of one family, the King of Heaven became one of us. When we love the world as he does, then his mission will be accomplished and we will be ready for heaven, because heaven will already be in our hearts.
I was in Newcastle about a month ago, and just before I was coming up to start Bible working, and I can remember thinking, you know, what am I even doing here? Why am I even a Christian? Do I even want to believe in a God? I guess I just had this moment of absolute lucidity where I saw myself for who I really was. And I'm sure we've all experienced that. We all get glimpses of ourselves from time to time. And if you're anything like me, they can be pretty terrifying. When we look at ourselves and we see ourselves for who we really are, it can be pretty scary. And Jeremiah sort of writes about this, and he says, "The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?" I realized in that moment that Christianity didn't bring me a lot of comfort. That as soon as you believe in a God of love, a God who is perfect, a God who is totally other-centered and totally unselfish, then as soon as you come face to face with a God like that, you're immediately aware of who you are. You're immediately aware of just how selfish you are. And in that moment, things get pretty hard. I realized that if you're a Christian and you believe that, then that can be a real struggle. If you're not a Christian, then who do you compare yourself to? All you compare yourself to is other people, right? And I don't know about you, but when I compare myself to other people, I come out looking pretty good most of the time. Not because I'm better than them, but because we're all equally pretty bad. We're all in the same boat. And so I was sort of struggling with that and struggling with the idea that as soon as you have this idea of a perfect God, then you necessarily have this idea that we're pretty bad. And we don't really like being told we're bad. It's not something that we want to accept easily. And I think that's why Christianity can be so challenging at times. And I think that's why there's lots of people out there that like this idea of a good God, but they don't like the idea that goes with it, that we're not so good. When you compare yourself to perfect love, it can be pretty hard to measure up. And I think that most people would rather live in a kind of alternate reality. I think most people would kind of want to live in a virtual reality, so to speak, rather than face who they actually are. And John writes a little bit about this. In fact, this is Jesus speaking, and he says this, "And this is the condemnation, that the light has come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil." In the darkness, you can't really see yourself. You can't really see other people. Have you ever noticed people look much more attractive in the dark? But in the light, you can't hide from who you are. Who you are is just revealed in all of your selfishness. Everything is put on display. That's the condemnation. That you can't live with who you are. And so as I was thinking this through, and I guess I realized that my thought process needed some reconfiguration. Because as Hannah was talking about, when God comes and finds us, that's all good and well, but what if we don't want to be found? What if we can't stand being in the presence of God? And I realized that the way we think needed to change, and I want to take you through that today. I want to suggest that we do want to be found today. That what Hannah's talking about, we want that to happen. And I want to share with you how I think our thinking, our way of viewing ourselves and viewing the world around us has to change for that to happen. So let's keep moving. Oh, we've covered that. Reconfiguration number 1. Seeing ourselves as God sees us. Because when we look at ourselves, we feel pretty condemned, right? We're afraid of who we are. At least that was my experience. But then as I was thinking about that down in Newcastle, I remembered possibly one of the best good news texts in the whole entire Bible. And it's John 3:17. Generally we go 3:16, but I reckon John 3:17 is even more impactful. It says this, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved." And I'm not sure if you've ever thought about this, but I don't hold the moral prerogative to judge any of you, to condemn any of you. We can't judge each other because we're all stumbling around in the dark, right? All have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. You can't judge me any more than I can judge you. But God can. God holds that moral prerogative in his hands, and he chooses not to. God is the only being in the universe capable of rightfully judging and condemning us. And he decides against it. And that's the good news. And I want to sort of talk a little bit more about that and how God views us and how maybe we can change the way we look at ourselves. Because what happens is we condemn ourselves. The only person condemning us, it isn't God. He's the only one that can. The only person condemning us is ourselves. The only person capable of condemning us is God, and he chooses not to. And John 3:16, this whole passage talks about this. It says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. He who believes in him is not condemned, but he who does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. And this is the condemnation, that light has come into the world and men love darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil." That's what we're talking about. God didn't condemn us, and we can't condemn ourselves. And we see this in the story of the woman caught in adultery. And I just wanted to read through the crux of it, because it says this in John 8:10 and 11. "When Jesus had raised himself up, and he saw no one but the woman, he said to her, 'Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you?' She said, 'No one, Lord.'" And, I sort of imagine that as, he's probably he's down on her level, and he's writing in the sand, and, the crowd just dissipates. And he stands up, and he kind of just looks around, and just, takes it all in. And then he asks her, "Does anyone condemn you?" And I imagine she's probably there thinking, maybe he will. I mean, she's guilty, isn't she? She did commit adultery. Is she deserving of punishment? But what does Jesus say to her? "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." And I want to suggest today that Jesus doesn't condemn us because he doesn't see us the way we see ourselves. 1 Corinthians 13 and verse 7 says that love bears all things, it believes all things, it hopes all things, and it endures all things. That's describing God. And I think when Paul is writing that God believes all things and hopes all things, I don't think when Jesus is there, he doesn't look at the woman caught in adultery and think and see her for who she is. I think he sees her for who she can be. And I think that's true of us today as well. I think God doesn't see what we are so much as he sees what we can be, because even we can't deal with the reality of who we are. And I'll give you a really good example of this. I went rock climbing with Robbie, one of the Bible workers up at Tweed this week, and it was really fun. Robbie is a good rock climber, genuinely good, and I am not a rock climber by any stretch of the imagination. I've probably been 2 or 3 times. And, we'd do these climbs, and there'd always be some tricky bits in the climbs. There's always some hard bits. And it'd take me 4 or 5 times to get up them, and you go up, and then you get too tired, so you have to rest, or you fall off. And, I wasn't sure I could make it to the top. But because Robbie believed that I could, and I knew that Robbie knew what he was talking about, then I believed that I could. It was pretty funny, actually, because, I'd take like 10, 15 minutes and I'd fall off and I'd like struggle up these climbs. And then Robbie would just like walk up it in like half a minute. Like, it was ridiculous. But I think that's the same with God. You see, when we look at ourselves, then we can think, look, I'm pretty awful. There's not much that I can do to save myself. There's nothing I can do to save myself. There's nothing I can do to improve. But if God looks at us and says, no, you've got potential, I believe in you, love hopes all things and believes all things, then we can believe God, because God should know what he's talking about, right? And when we experience that in our own lives, and when we experience God's love and its power to change, and we experience God working in our lives, then we come to reconfiguration number 2. And that is, not only do we see ourselves differently, but we start to see other people differently. We start to see other people through God's eyes. And 1 John 4:19 sums this up really well. And I love the contemporary English version. It says, we love because God loved us first. It's when we experience God's love in our lives, and it's when God believes in us, that we can take that and we can then believe in other people. And John expands on this just a couple of verses down in the next chapter. If we believe that Jesus is truly Christ, we are God's children. Everyone who loves the Father will also love his children. It's just a natural outcome. When we've experienced God changing our lives, then we want to be a part of that journey with other people. And I'm sure you've all heard of like the great commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And then he says, love others as much as you love yourself. In other words, in the same way that you look at yourself, in the same way that God looks at you, when you can believe what he's saying about you, then that's the attitude that you've got to have towards others. That you've got to see others not as they are, but as what they can be. And that's love. And David sort of encapsulates this whole experience. What Hannah's been talking about, what I've been talking about. Because David, I'm sure most of you would be familiar with the story. He commits adultery, and then he murders the husband. And the husband isn't just anyone. The husband is one of his elite soldiers, probably one of his friends. And Nathan comes to him and points out what he's done. And David prays this prayer in Psalm 51. He's realized just how terrible he is. He has this moment of absolute lucidity. And he says, create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me. Restore to me the joy of your salvation, and uphold me by your generous spirit. And when you've done all that, then I'll teach transgressors your ways, and sinners should be converted to you. For David, there's just this logical progression where you go from experiencing God in your own life, restoring the joy of his salvation, to naturally wanting to share that with other people. And naturally sort of progressing to where, hey, I was in that spot. I'm a sinner. I transgress your laws. And now that you've believed in me, then I can believe in other people as well. And I can share that with them. And that's why Hannah and I are Bible workers. That's why we do what we do. Not because we're perfect, not because we're so good, not because of anything. about ourselves, but because we've experienced God working in our lives, and we want to share that with other people. And yeah, that's just something that we really wanted to share with you, Jonah.
Yeah. I guess there's just one thing I really want to ask, and it's like, will you let Jesus carry you? Will you let him find you in whatever condition you are in right now, and actually believe that he finds joy in you in every part of the journey? Just like, I just ask that, I guess everyone, would you be able to just close your eyes, and we're going to close off in a prayer, but we're just going to ask some things and just allow you to decide for yourself. So if we could all just close our eyes, guys.
Dear God, we just come before you, and we're just so thankful for who you are. We want to thank you for coming and finding us and picking us up and carrying us home. We want to thank you that you give us the confidence to believe what you say you'll do in us. And we want to thank you just that we can come here today and acknowledge that. And we just pray that as we go throughout the next week and year and the rest of our lives, that we keep that fresh in our minds and that we share that with others. And we just pray this in your name. Amen.